Mearsheimer, your 6 minutes. Let's have your opening statement, sir.
It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming out to hear this debate tonight. What I'd like to do is pick up where Steve left off and talk about the costs and consequences of being a crusader state. And let me start first with the costs, the human costs of being a crusader state. Let me give you two examples. First has to do with a study that was done by the Watson Center at Brown University that looked at the number of people who have been killed, either directly through combat or indirectly, as a result of the various wars that the United States has been deeply engaged in the greater Middle East since 9/11 or since 2001. And what the Watson Center discovers is that between 4.5 million and 4.6 million people have been killed in the greater Middle East since 9/11 as a result of these wars. Let me give you another example. And this has to do with sanctions. As you know, the United States is addicted to sanctioning countries all over the world. And sanctions are often used for the purposes of regime change, which of course is what crusading is all about. There is a magazine called The Lancet, which is one of the most prestigious medical journals in the world. And last August, this is August 2025, it issued a study which reported that unilateral sanctions by the United States over a 50-year period, this goes from 1971 to 2021, over that 50-year period, unilateral sanctions by the United States resulted in 28 million deaths. Just think about those numbers. This is what you get when you turn into a crusader state. Now, some people may argue that this makes good sense, that these horrendous costs are justified by the end result. This is an argument that Madeleine Albright made in a famous conversation with Leslie Stahl of CBS. Leslie Stahl said to her, you know that 500,000 children have died in Iraq as a result of U.S. sanctions. This was in 1996. And Leslie Stahl asked Madeleine Albright if she thought that was justified. And Madeleine Albright shockingly said that she thought it was the right thing to do, to in effect murder 500,000 Iraqi children for the purposes of crusading. Of course, it didn't work out that way, and what happened is that we had to invade Iraq, as you all remember, in 2003. The sanctions didn't work. This brings us to the whole question of the consequences of these acts where we crusade around the world, the consequences of regime change. Just to start, we have a rich literature in academia which shows that when you knock off regimes and you try to promote democracy, it fails almost every time. The only case since World War II where we succeeded in regime change was in Panama in 1989. This means we have not succeeded in producing a regime change that led to a democracy since the Cold War ended, since 9/11. This is a policy that fails almost every time. If you have any doubts about that, think about Afghanistan. We knocked off the Taliban. Who's in control in Afghanistan now? The Taliban. Think about Iraq, one of the greatest foreign policy disasters in American history. We went in there in 2003. Obama took us out in 2011. We had to go back in 2014 to deal with ISIS, and we're still there. And then there's Iran. I believe that Iran will eventually be proven to be the most disastrous foreign policy decision in American military history. So if you look at Afghanistan, you look at Iraq, and you look at Iran, you see, as the academic literature says, that regime change does not work. It's remarkably difficult to promote democracy at the end of a rifle barrel. One final point. One might think that crusaders are in favor of promoting democracy, period. But that's not true. Crusaders distinguish between like-minded democracies, this is a phrase that Mike often uses, and other democracies. And Mike is interested in producing a world with like-minded democracies. And of course, the end result of this is that we go around the world and we knock off democracies that we do not consider to be like-minded. So you should remember as we go through this debate tonight that the United States has a rich history of knocking off democracies that are not like-minded around the world. Iran 53, Guatemala 54, Chile 73, I could go on and on. We have a rich history of knocking off democracies. These are not like-minded democracies. These are in effect monster democracies. So what we have here, the bottom line, is we have a situation where the United States tries to promote like-minded democracies and fails. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, audience, for keeping our debaters on time and on their toes. Our last opening statement goes to Toria Nuland.
Well, thank you, Munk team, for the opportunity to join this great audience and my colleagues here on the stage for an important conversation. Let me start where Secretary Pompeo finished. Neither the United States nor Canada nor any of the great democracies can afford to cede the world to monsters or allow them to upend the global order that has benefited free nations for 80 years. Mike and I believe, as he said, that the U.S. and our allies are far better protected by confronting those monsters before they grow powerful enough to threaten us at home or to destroy the foundations of the world that we have built. But as you've heard, our opponents have a different view. They called it offshore balancing, a realist grand strategy, in a piece that they co-authored in 2016. And here's the key tenet of that strategy, and I quote, "If there is no potential hegemon in sight, in Europe, in North Asia, or in the Gulf, then there's no reason to deploy ground or air forces there, and little reason for a large military establishment at home." As the great crooner Sam Cooke would say, ladies and gentlemen, what a wonderful world that would be, right? But it's not our world. From Putin's 4 years of vicious war against Ukraine, to China's coercion of Taiwan and its neighbors, to Iran's refusal to give up its nuclear weapons capability and its dominance now of the Straits of Hormuz, the dangers, the monsters seeking to dominate Europe, Northeast Asia, and the Gulf are growing stronger. The professor suggests that the U.S. turn to regional forces as the first line of defense. If those powers cannot contain a potential hegemon on their own, however, the U.S. must help get the job done. Thank you both for that. That's precisely where we are now on all three continents, and it's been that way for most of the last 80 years. Our allies need our help keeping monsters at bay. Maybe each could do more, but we are not, sadly, professors, in your wonderful world. We should have learned that lesson in the last bloody century. As long as humans roam the earth, monsters will emerge among us. In the 1930s, we offshore balanced our way into letting Hitler almost take over Europe, and the Japanese imperial forces almost dominate Asia. But when Americans, Canadians, and free nations everywhere joined forces to vanquish those monsters and then built institutions like NATO, the EU, and the UN, we ushered in the longest period of security and prosperity the world has ever known. But as Mike has said, hunting doesn't necessarily mean going to war or regime change, as they're trying to accuse us of. As a career diplomat, I will always choose diplomacy first, but it's got to be backed by power to deter, to contain, to constrain the monster, to dig a ditch that he falls into. if we can't reach a settlement that neutralizes him or keeps him in his lair. War must be the last resort, but history shows some monsters will not stop until they're vanquished. As practitioners, Mike and I also know that each monster is different. Each requires a different set of tools, ranging from inducements to negotiations, to deterrence, to political and economic pressure, and combinations of those. As strong nations, we have a full toolkit, but locking away those tools or watching from the sidelines is not the right answer. Nor will Mike and I argue that the U.S. has always deployed its tools right, or in the right way, or gotten the right outcome. But not acting is often more dangerous, waiting not just for the monster to appear at our door, but for it to get into the house. I personally remember vividly a time when we did not act, and paid dearly for it. During countless conversations that I witnessed in Moscow in the 1990s, including with Putin, senior Russians warned us about the growth of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and its potential threat to the United States. U.S. intelligence didn't take it seriously. How could some dudes hiding in caves actually threaten us? The Russians must be trying to trick us out of our offshore armchair, carefully balanced. We learned our lesson on September 11th. Inaction, inattention to the monsters in our midst can often be more costly than the mistakes we inevitably make during a complex monster hunt. Here's another thing. Mike and I will not always agree with each other on every aspect of every monster hunting expedition. Tonight you'll hear Secretary Pompeo support our current course of action in Iran, and you'll hear me oppose the war and argue that we could have and still should do much more with economic tools, support for the democratic opposition, and forceful negotiations. But we both agree Iran must never have a nuclear weapon, and under the mullahs and the IRGC, it poses an unacceptable risk to the region, to the freedom of navigation, to the U.S., to Canada, and to global peace and security. We have to pressure this regime until it stops its monstrous behavior or it falls. We're going to talk about all these things tonight, but here's the bottom line. We enjoy the peace and prosperity and security we have today as democracies because we hunt the monsters before they take over. I can't speak for Mearsheimer and Walt, but Secretary Pompeo and I don't want to live in their monster world, and nor should you. Thank you.